This is an introduction to functional groups of organic compounds. MF Mayer group production. Functional groups. Functional groups are responsible for the characteristic chemical behavior of compounds. Here's an example of a molecule that contains different functional groups as shown here. Functional groups typically feature pi bonds and/or heteroatoms with one or more lone pairs of electrons. Here are the general structures of functional groups found in organic compounds that will be discussed in this tutorial. We'll start off first with hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons are compounds composed entirely of hydrogens and carbons, as their name would suggest. Alkanes are the simplest of all hydrocarbons. Let's look at some examples of alkanes. First, we'll look at methane. Methane, the simplest of all alkanes, features a single carbon surrounded with four hydrogens bonded once as a sigma bond. These hydrogens are arranged in a tetrahedral shape around the central carbon. By adding one carbon successively, additional homologs are produced. Ethane is a two-carbon hydrocarbon, and likewise propane features three carbons and butane with four. Note that alkanes may exist in acyclic and non-cyclic forms. Here, butane is shown next to its cyclic form, cyclobutane. Alkenes are also hydrocarbons, but differ from alkanes in that alkenes feature two carbons bonded by a double bond, which features one sigma bond and one pi bond. The simplest of alkenes is ethylene. Ethylene features four hydrogens surrounding two carbons that have a double bond between them. An additional example of an alkene is butene. Notice that butene features four carbons, two of which are terminal methyl groups. Because of the double bond, the two halves joined by the double bond cannot rotate with respect to each other. Thus, butene exists in two different forms, each requiring their own name, either trans-2-butene or cis-2-butene. Alkynes are similar to alkenes and alkanes in that they're all hydrocarbons, but differ in that they feature two carbons bonded by a triple bond, which features one sigma bond and two pi bonds. The simplest of all alkynes is acetylene. Acetylene features a central two-carbon triple bond. Each carbon is then singly bonded to a hydrogen. Propyne is an alkyne that features three carbons, one of which is a methyl group, which is singly bonded to one of the triply bonded carbons, such that the compound has an overall linear structure. Alkynes, as well as other types of functional groups, can be found in larger, more complicated compounds, such as the one shown here, mestranol. Note that mestranol features its alkyne group here. Aromatic compounds are a special type of cyclic organic compounds. Benzene, shown here, is a hydrocarbon example of an aromatic compound. Benzene has three pi bonds in its ring structure, and through resonance these pi bond electrons are evenly dispersed throughout the ring. The two possible resonance structures of benzene are shown here. Note that the top and bottom are different representations of benzene, but both are benzene, while the left and the right molecules are resonance structures of one another. Neither molecule on the left or the right is found. Instead, a hybrid of the two is. Because these pi bonds are able to move as illustrated, they are considered to be evenly dispersed throughout the ring. Hence, benzene is usually drawn with an inner ring to signify this. Additional examples of aromatic compounds include trinitrotoluene, shown here. Notice that it has three nitrogen-containing groups, showing that non-hydrocarbon compounds can be aromatic as well. Other examples include pyridine, which also contains the nitrogen, but it's part of the ring structure, and styrene, which possesses an alkene group as well. Nitrogen-containing functional groups. We'll start off by first taking a look at amines. Amines feature a nitrogen that is singly bonded to three other groups. One nitrogen, featuring three hydrogens, is ammonia, which is the simplest of all amines. If one of the featured hydrogens of ammonia is replaced with a carbon group, then this results into what is referred as a primary amine. Likewise, if two of the hydrogens featured on ammonia are replaced with carbon-containing groups, then a secondary amine results. And lastly, if all three hydrogens featured on ammonia are replaced with carbon-containing groups, then a tertiary amine results. If four substituents are attached to a nitrogen, then this would resolve as an ammonium cation, shown here. Specific examples of amine-containing organic compounds include methylamine, which features one carbon-containing group and two hydrogens, making methylamine a primary amine. Diethylamine features a central nitrogen bonded to a single hydrogen and to two ethyl groups. Diethylamine is considered to be a secondary amine. Triethylamine is similar to diethylamine, except it features a central nitrogen bonded to three ethyl groups, rendering this amine as a tertiary amine. More than one amine can be found on larger organic compounds. Here's an example of an organic compound that features three different types of amines. Let's identify the three different types of amines. On the far left, there is a secondary amine featuring a nitrogen bonded to an ethyl group and the rest of the compound. On the bottom center, there is a tertiary amine, which is connected to an ethyl group and to two other carbon chains. And lastly, on the right, there is a primary amine with a single nitrogen bonded to two hydrogens and one carbon-containing group. Amines. Amines feature a carbon atom doubly bonded to a nitrogen atom. The carbon is then bonded to groups which can be either a hydrogen or another carbon. The nitrogen in the amine is also bonded to either a hydrogen or a carbon. An example of an amine is N-benzylidene aniline, which features a central amine bond, shown here. The carbon in the amine group is then bonded to an aromatic phenyl group and a hydrogen. The nitrogen is bonded only to an aromatic phenyl group. Nitriles are similar to amines in that they consist of a nitrogen bonded to a carbon, but differ in that this nitrogen is bonded triply to the carbon, and the carbon is then further bonded to either a hydrogen or another carbon. Let's look at some examples of nitrile-containing organic compounds. Shown here is acetonitrile, which has its R group replaced with a single methyl group forming a 2-carbon nitrile. The simplest of nitriles is shown here, formonitrile, which is sometimes referred to as hydrogen cyanide. Formonitrile consists of a carbon and a nitrogen atom triply bonded and features a single hydrogen bonded to the carbon atom. Alcohols and ethers. We'll first take a look at alcohols, which feature a carbon-containing group bonded to an OH group, otherwise known as a hydroxy group. The carbon is then bonded to either additional carbons or hydrogens. If all three of these groups are replaced with hydrogens, then this results in methanol, the simplest of all alcohols. Notice that methanol features a methyl group and an OH group. This is why sometimes methanol is referred to as methyl alcohol. As like with amines, alcohols can be primary, secondary, or tertiary. If one of the hydrogens of this methyl alcohol is replaced with a carbon group, then a primary alcohol results. An example of a primary alcohol is ethanol, which is a 2-carbon alcohol. Likewise, if another hydrogen is also replaced with a carbon group, then a secondary alcohol results. Isopropyl alcohol is an example of a secondary alcohol. Notice it features 2 terminal methyl groups and contains 3 carbons. And lastly, if all 3 hydrogens of the original methyl alcohol are replaced with carbon-containing groups, then a tertiary alcohol results. Tert-butyl alcohol is an example of a tertiary alcohol. It features 3 methyl groups on the central carbon. Now let's review primary, secondary, and tertiary alcohols. The following organic compound contains all three types. Let's label them. On the far left, there's an example of a tertiary alcohol, shown here. In the lower right is an example of a secondary alcohol. And lastly, on the far right, you'll find a primary alcohol. Ethers. Ethers feature a central oxygen bonded to two carbon-containing groups. If the two carbon groups attached to the central oxygen are identical, then a symmetrical ether results. Diethyl ether is an example of a symmetrical ether. It features two ethyl groups attached to the central oxygen. On the other hand, if two carbon groups attached to the central oxygen are different from one another, then an unsymmetrical ether results. Benzyl ethyl ether is an example of an unsymmetrical ether. It features an aromatic benzyl group and an ethyl group attached to the central oxygen. Sulfur-containing functional groups. Let's start with thiols. Thiols consist of a single sulfur bonded to a carbon group and a hydrogen. Methane thiol is an example of a simple thiol. It features a methyl group as the carbon-containing group and a single hydrogen bonded to the sulfur atom. Thiol groups can appear in various organic compounds. Some examples include trans-2-butene thiol, which is an alkene that contains a central carbon-carbon double bond and features a thiol group, indicated here. 3-methyl-1-butane thiol is a branched hydrocarbon alkane that features a thiol group on its end. Lastly, 2-quinoline methane thiol features two aromatic rings, one of which contains an amine-like group and has a thiol group as shown here. Sulfides are similar to thiols in that they contain a sulfur atom, but differ in that this sulfur is bonded to two carbon-containing groups. Like ethers, sulfides can be either symmetrical or unsymmetrical. Examples of sulfides include dimethyl sulfide, which features two methyl groups bonded to the sulfur, resulting in a symmetrical sulfide. Contrastingly, methyl coenzyme M features two sulfur atoms, but only the top one is considered to be a sulfide. The top sulfur is bonded once to a methyl group and to a two-carbon chain which is connected to the rest of the organic compound. This makes methyl coenzyme M an unsymmetrical sulfide. Alkyl halides. Alkyl halides feature a carbon-halogen bond as indicated by the green box. The carbon is then bonded to either additional carbon-containing groups or hydrogens, or a combination of the two. The simplest of alkyl halides is a methyl halide, which results when these three groups are replaced with hydrogens. This methyl halide then designates the rest of its name depending on which halogen is used as the halide. In this example, a fluorine is used, resulting in methyl fluoride. Like alcohols, alkyl halides can have a primary, secondary, and tertiary designations. If one of the hydrogens of this methyl halide is substituted with a carbon group, then this results in a primary alkyl halide. Propyl iodide is an example of a primary alkyl halide. It features three carbons and utilizes iodine as its halogen. Likewise, if two of the hydrogens are replaced with a carbon group, then a secondary alkyl halide results. Chlorocyclohexane is an example of a secondary alkyl halide. It features a 6-carbon ring as its two carbon groups and utilizes a chlorine atom as its halogen. This pattern continues if all three hydrogens of methyl halide are replaced with a carbon group, then a tertiary alkyl halide results. Tert-butyl bromide is an example of a tertiary alkyl halide and features 4 carbons, 3 of which are methyl groups attached to the carbon, and it utilizes a bromine as its halogen. Carbonyl-containing functional groups are functional groups that contain a carbonyl group. A carbonyl consists of an oxygen doubly bonded to a carbon, which is then bonded to additional groups. Here are 5 different carbonyl-containing functional groups, and here are the carbonyl groups within the 5 functional groups. We'll first take a look at aldehydes and ketones. Aldehydes. Aldehydes consist of a carbonyl group which is bonded to a hydrogen and a carbon or hydrogen. Some examples of aldehydes include formaldehyde, which is the simplest of all aldehydes and features a central carbonyl bonded to 2 hydrogen atoms. If one of these hydrogens is replaced with a methyl group, then acetaldehyde results. Benzaldehyde is also an aldehyde, as its name would suggest, and features a carbonyl group attached to an aromatic ring. Ketones are similar to aldehydes in that they have a central carbonyl group. But ketones differ in that the carbonyl carbon is bonded to 2 carbons. Like thiols or ethers, ketones can be symmetrical or unsymmetrical, depending on which carbon groups are attached to the carbonyl carbon. Acetone is an example of a symmetrical ketone and features 2 methyl groups attached to the carbonyl carbon atom. Acetophenone is an example of an unsymmetrical ketone and features an aromatic ring and a methyl group as its 2 carbon groups attached to the central carbonyl. Cyclohexanone is an example of a symmetrical ketone that features a ring as both carbon-carbon groups attached to the central carbonyl group. Carboxylic acids and esters. These groups contain a carbonyl functional group that attaches to a hydrogen or a carbon-containing group and an oxygen-containing group. We'll first take a look at carboxylic acids. Carboxylic acids consist of a carbonyl group that is bonded to an OH group and either a hydrogen or a carbon group. The simplest carboxylic acid is formic acid, which features the central carbonyl group, an OH group, and a hydrogen. The hydrogen in the OH group is the hydrogen that becomes donated in bronzidyloric acid-base reactions. Acetic acid is a 2-carbon carboxylic acid and features a methyl group and an OH group. Lastly, benzoic acid is an example of an aromatic carboxylic acid. Esters. Esters feature a central carbonyl group that is bonded to an oxygen atom. The oxygen is then bonded to a carbon, and the carbonyl carbon is bonded to either a carbon or a hydrogen. Ethyl acetate is a common ester, which features the carbonyl group attached to an oxygen, which is then bonded to an ethyl group, while the carbonyl carbon is bonded to a methyl group. Methyl benzoate is an example of an aromatic ester, featuring a methyl group as its carbon group and an aromatic ring for its other carbon group. Amides. Amides feature a carbonyl group that is bonded to a nitrogen. The carbon of the carbonyl is then bonded to either a hydrogen or a carbon, while the central nitrogen atom is bonded to 2 carbons or hydrogens, or a combination of the 2. N,N-dimethylformamide, or DMF, is one of the simplest amides. It features a carbonyl carbon bonded to a hydrogen, and a nitrogen bonded to 2 methyl groups. Kevlar is a material that contains multiple amides and features aromatic rings and hydrogen bonds that make this into a strong polymeric material. Note all the amides indicated in red. Now let's look at an example problem reviewing most of the functional groups discussed in this tutorial. Work through the molecule from the left to the right. Pay attention to pi bonds and heteroatoms. Together, let's circle and identify each functional group, and we will differentiate alcohols, amines, and alkyl halides, which can be primary, secondary, or tertiary. Starting on the left, you'll find a primary alkyl fluoride, a secondary alcohol, sulfide, primary alcohol, ketone, and an amide. Moving down, aldehyde, alkene, and a carboxylic acid. Continuing, a secondary alkyl bromide, a tertiary amine, ester, an alkyne. Here's an ether, an aromatic ring, and another alkene. Here's a secondary amine, a tertiary alcohol, a thiol, nitrile, an amine, and a tertiary alkyl chloride. Hydrocarbons, alkyl halides, nitrogen-containing functional groups, alcohols and ethers, thiols and sulfides, aldehydes and ketones, carboxylic acids and esters, and amides, which are all carbonyl-containing functional groups. These are the most common functional groups found in organic compounds. This concludes our short introduction to functional groups found in organic compounds. Be sure to check out other great MF Mayer Group productions.